Today, everything fell into place. The signs had been there for months, maybe years, but I had ignored them, dismissed them as paranoia or the natural drift of a long marriage. But now, staring at the photograph in my hand, I realized the truth had been knocking at my door all along. My wife was cheating on me. The envelope had been waiting for me on my desk when I arrived at work this morning, tucked neatly between architectural blueprints and project drafts. No return address. No note. Just a plain white envelope that felt heavier than it should have been. I almost didn't open it. A part of me hesitated, sensing something ugly inside. But curiosity, or maybe some darker instinct, got the better of me. Inside, I found a single photograph. Julia, my wife of 10 years, in the arms of another man. The image was sharp and unmistakable. Her face was turned toward him, her lips curved into a smile I hadn't seen in years, her hand resting on his chest with an intimacy that made my stomach churn. His face was half-shadowed, but I could make out enough. Tall, broad-shouldered, well-dressed. A man who, at a glance, seemed familiar in a way I couldn't yet place. My heart pounded as I studied the details. The restaurant's soft golden lighting, the half-full glasses of wine, the way her fingers curled around his wrist like she belonged there. I set the photo down carefully, feeling the weight of it settle into my chest. I could have denied it. Could have told myself that this was a misunderstanding, that someone was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, I already knew. I had felt her slipping away. The late nights, the impersonal kisses, the endless excuses. Just a girl's night, David. Work's been crazy. I'll be home late. You worry too much. Now, holding this photo, I realized I hadn't been worrying enough. I reached for the envelope, searching for a note. Something to explain why a stranger had decided to shatter my world today. But there was nothing else. Just the photograph. As if whoever had sent it knew that was all I needed. I leaned back in my chair, my hands gripping the armrests as my mind raced through the past year, connecting dots I had refused to see before. A man's cologne lingering on her coat. The way she had started dressing differently, sexier, more deliberate. Her sudden interest in weekend retreats that never seemed to include me. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I was a man who built things, who understood structure and design, who planned every detail meticulously. And right now, I needed a plan. One thing was certain. I wasn't going to confront her yet. No, that would be too easy for her. I needed proof. I needed to know just how deep this betrayal ran. And most of all, I needed to make sure that when I finally did expose her, she would have nowhere left to run. I spent the rest of the day staring at the photograph, barely hearing anything my team said during meetings. The details of blueprints and structural designs blurred together, irrelevant compared to the image burned into my brain. By the time I left the office, I had a plan. I wasn't going to let emotions dictate my next move. Anger wouldn't solve this. Revenge, though tempting, wasn't my endgame. What I wanted was control. Control over how this unfolded. Control over what happened next. I needed more than just a single photo. I needed undeniable proof, something concrete enough to not just confront Julia, but to dismantle whatever she was scheming behind my back. Because something told me this wasn't just about sex. Julia had always been ambitious, calculating. When we first met, that was what had drawn me to her. She was sharp, quick-witted, a woman who knew what she wanted and took it. But over the years, that fire had turned cold, directed not at building our life together, but at something else, something I hadn't yet figured out. So I made the first real move in my plan. I hired a private investigator. It wasn't difficult. I had a few contacts through work, clients who dealt in security, high-stakes business deals, people who knew how to find things others wanted to stay hidden. Within an hour, I had the name of someone discreet and efficient, a man named Carter Reynolds. When I called, his voice was gruff, no nonsense. You have something you need to know, or someone you need to disappear? Just information, I said, keeping my voice level. A woman. I need to know where she goes, who she sees. And I need proof. A brief pause. Then a chuckle. Classic. Send me the details. I'll start tonight. I sent him everything, Julia's name, her car, her usual haunts. Then, I waited. That night, Julia came home late. Again. I sat in the living room, pretending to be immersed in a book while the clock ticked past 11. When I finally heard the front door unlock, I kept my expression neutral, even as my pulse drummed in my ears. She walked in, looking flawless as always. Her hair was swept back, her dress elegant but casual, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She smelled like expensive perfume, but underneath it, I caught something else. A scent I didn't recognize. A man's cologne. She smiled when she saw me, but there was something off about it. Forced. "You're up late," she said, setting her purse down on the entryway table. I closed my book slowly, meeting her gaze. "Couldn't sleep?" She nodded, walking over to pour herself a glass of wine, moving through the house like it belonged only to her. Like I was just a guest in her life now. "You could have called," I said casually. "Let me know you'd be late." She hesitated, just for a second, before taking a sip of wine. "I told you this morning. Drinks with Claire and the girls." Lies. But I didn't call her out on it. Not yet. Instead, I got up, stretched, and pressed a casual kiss to her cheek. "Glad you had fun," I murmured. She stiffened, just for a second, before flashing me a bright, practiced smile. "Of course. You worry too much." "Not anymore." I went to bed that night knowing the next few days would bring answers. And once I had them, Julia wouldn't just lose me. She'd lose everything. The first report from Carter arrived 3 days later. It came in the form of a secure email, brief and direct. A single attachment labeled, "Surveillance, Julia." I hesitated for only a moment before clicking it open. Inside was a series of photos. Julia wasn't with Claire. She wasn't at a bar laughing over cocktails with the girls. She was with him, the man from the first photograph. But now, I had more than just a still frame of a stolen moment. I had an entire timeline. The pictures showed them at an upscale restaurant, their hands brushing across the table, her body leaning toward his like a magnet drawn to steel. Another showed them leaving, his hand possessively on the small of her back as they stepped into a black car together. And the last image, the one that clenched my jaw and turned my blood ice cold, was taken outside a hotel, a luxury suite. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m. I stared at the screen, my breath slow and controlled, even as my pulse roared in my ears. There was no denying it now. Julia wasn't just having an affair. She was living an entirely separate life. I exhaled, forcing the anger down, locking it away. Not yet. Carter's message was simple. "She's meeting him again tomorrow. 8 p.m. Same hotel." That was all I needed. I had the truth. Now, I just needed to decide how to use it. That evening, Julia came home at 7:30. She kissed my cheek, her lips soft but hollow, like she was pressing them against a mask instead of her husband. "Long day?" she asked, slipping off her coat. "Yeah," I said. "You?" She nodded, already moving toward the bedroom. "Exhausting. I might turn in early." I watched her, analyzing every movement, every carefully placed word. She had become so good at lying that it was almost impressive. But the most dangerous kind of liar was the one who believed their own deception. And Julia believed I was still blind. She showered, wrapped herself in silk, and slid into bed beside me, as if she hadn't been tangled in another man's sheets less than 24 hours ago. I lay next to her in the dark, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing, wondering how many times she had done this. Come home to me with the scent of another man still lingering on her skin. I wanted to ask her. I wanted to turn over, grab her wrist, and force her to admit it. But that would be too easy. Instead, I closed my eyes and whispered, "I love you." She hesitated for half a second. Then, she whispered it back. A reflex. Nothing more. Tomorrow, she would go to him again. And tomorrow, I would be watching. And when the moment was right, she would see what it felt like to lose everything. The next evening, I left work early. I told Julia I had a late client meeting, something she barely acknowledged as she busied herself getting ready. I watched from the hallway as she stood in front of the mirror, fixing her hair, applying just the right shade of lipstick. Not for me. She was dressing for him. Her perfume hung thick in the air, something floral and expensive, the scent clinging to her skin like a secret. She slipped into a black dress, one I hadn't seen before. A new purchase, no doubt. And then, with a final glance at her reflection, she grabbed her clutch, checked her phone, and left without a word. She didn't even bother to lie this time. Good. Because I was done pretending, too. By the time I reached the hotel, Carter was already in position. "She's here," he murmured through the earpiece. "Room 1210. They checked in 10 minutes ago." I sat in my car across the street, gripping the steering wheel, steadying my breath. The hotel was upscale. Marble entrance, sleek glass doors, the kind of place Julia would expect for her affairs. I had options. I could storm inside, confront them both. I could drag that bastard out into the hallway, force her to watch as the world saw exactly what she was. But no, that would make me the emotional, betrayed husband. I needed to be smarter. I grabbed my phone and called Carter. "Do you have the audio?" "Crystal clear," he said. "And the video feed is running." "Good," I said. "Send me everything." I waited, staring at the hotel entrance, watching as strangers came and went, oblivious to the war raging inside me. Within minutes, my phone pinged. A single video file. I hesitated for only a second before pressing play. The footage was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable. Julia's laughter. Low, sultry. The sound of a woman who had no guilt, no shame. Then, his voice. Smooth, cocky. A man who thought he had one. "Does he suspect anything?" he asked. A pause. Then Julia's voice, amused. "David? Please. He's too busy with work to notice anything. He still thinks we have date nights." She laughed. He laughed. And something inside me, something I had been holding on to, finally broke. I ended the call with Carter. It was time for the next step. By the time Julia returned home, I was waiting. I sat in the dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey in my hand, my laptop open on the coffee table. The house was silent, the air thick with something unspoken. She didn't see me at first. She was humming to herself, slipping off her heels, moving through the house like a woman with nothing to hide. "Good night," I asked. She froze. For half a second, just half, she hesitated. Then, she turned, smile perfectly in place. "David, you're home early." I took a slow sip of whiskey, watching her. "Yeah, meeting got canceled." She nodded, moving toward me. "You should have texted." "I would have." I pressed play. Her voice filled the room. "David? Please." He's too busy with work to notice anything. The color drained from her face. She turned toward the laptop, her eyes widening as she saw the video. The grainy image of her and Ryan, sprawled across the hotel bed, whispering their secrets into the dark. Her breath hitched. "David, Don't," I said, my voice sharp. She swallowed hard, her mask slipping. "Where did you get that?" "I know everything," I said, standing. "The hotel, the late nights, the money you've been siphoning from our accounts. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" She was breathing fast now, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. It wasn't like that." I laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "Really? Then what was it like, Julia? Enlighten me." Her mouth opened, but no words came. Because there was nothing left to say. I grabbed my phone, scrolling to my lawyer's contact. "I've already filed for divorce. And don't bother fighting for the money. I've locked you out of everything." Her eyes widened. "David, wait." "Get out," I said. She blinked, as if she hadn't heard me. "What?" "You heard me. Get out. Tonight. Pack whatever you can carry and leave." She stared at me, realization sinking in. The power she had, the control, gone. In an instant, her lip trembled. "Where am I supposed to go?" I shrugged. "Ask Ryan." Her face crumpled. I turned away, walking toward the stairs, feeling lighter than I had in years. Julia's voice followed me, small, desperate. "David, please." I didn't stop, because for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. The silence that followed my words was heavier than any argument, any screaming match, any slap of accusations across the face. Julia just stood there, barefoot, frozen, her perfectly curated life crumbling around her. I had imagined this moment 100 times in the past few days. What I would say, how she would react, if she would break down in tears or try to turn the blame on me. But now that it was here, it was almost underwhelming. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just stood there, her lips slightly parted, her breath uneven, as if reality had finally hit her like a train she never saw coming. David, please, let's talk about this. I turned on my heel, my hand gripping the railing of the staircase. I could have ignored her. I should have ignored her. But there was something darkly satisfying about hearing her beg. So I gave her one last look. Talk about what, Julia? She swallowed, stepping toward me, her bare feet soundless against the hardwood floor. About us. About everything. Everything? I repeated, a bitter chuckle escaping my throat. You mean about how you spent the last year screwing Ryan behind my back? How you laughed at me while you planned a future without me? That everything? She flinched, her hands trembling as she reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous tick I had seen 1,000 times before. I never meant for it to happen like this. You never meant to get caught. Her eyes darted to the laptop, the damning video still frozen on the screen. I saw the gears turning in her mind, scrambling for a way out, some way to twist this in her favor. Not this time. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking just enough to sound genuine. I still love you. I laughed. I actually laughed. Love me? I repeated, shaking my head. You don't love me, Julia. You love what I gave you. You love the house, the cars, the vacations. You love being the wife of a successful architect. But me? No. You stopped loving me a long time ago. She opened her mouth, but I wasn't finished. And that's fine, I continued, my voice sharper now, cutting through the thick air between us. Because I stopped loving you the moment I realized you were a liar. Her face twisted, hurt, or maybe just frustrated that she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. David, please, don't do this. We built a life together. We had a life together, I corrected. You burned it to the ground. She took a step closer, reaching for my arm, her fingers brushing against my skin. It was pathetic, really. She still thought she had power over me. That a touch, a whisper, a carefully placed tear could undo everything. It almost made me pity her. Almost. I pulled away. Pack your things and leave. She blinked up at me. Where am I supposed to go? I smirked. Try Ryan. Her face darkened. That was the moment she realized it. Ryan wasn't going to take her in. He liked her when she was untouchable, a forbidden fruit. But now? Now she was exposed. Vulnerable. And Ryan wasn't the type to deal with messy. She had lost everything. And I had just one. Julia didn't move. She stood there, her breath uneven, her fingers twitching at her sides as if she wanted to argue, to fight back, to say something. Anything that would undo the damage. But there was no coming back from this. I had stripped her of every excuse, every carefully crafted lie, every illusion she had built around herself. And now, all that was left was the truth. David, she tried again, her voice softer now, laced with something dangerously close to desperation. Please, I made a mistake, but we can fix this. I scoffed. A mistake? I took a step forward, towering over her. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying something you don't mean in an argument. This, I gestured to the laptop, to the undeniable proof of her betrayal, was a choice. She flinched, her lip trembling. You chose to cheat. You chose to lie to me. You chose to humiliate me. My voice was eerily calm now, every word delivered with a precision that cut deeper than any scream ever could. And now, I'm choosing to walk away. Silence. For the first time, true fear flashed in her eyes. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing the life she had built on my back. She was finally realizing that without me, she had nothing. David, she whispered, stepping closer again. I don't love him. I laughed. A sharp, hollow sound. Then why did you do it? Her mouth opened, but no words came. Because she didn't have an answer, not one that would justify this. So she did what she always did. She tried to manipulate. Her expression softened, her posture shifted, and suddenly, she was the Julia I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who had once made me believe in forever. "Do you remember Paris?" she murmured. "Our honeymoon? How we got caught in the rain and danced in the street." I clenched my jaw. "Do you remember how much we loved each other?" she continued, stepping closer. "That hasn't changed, David. We can get back to that. We can." "Stop." The word was sharp, final. Her face crumpled. "Don't do this." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "You did this, Julia. You." Tears welled in her eyes now, but they meant nothing. She had weaponized them too many times before. I wouldn't fall for it. Not again. I turned and walked toward the staircase, my voice steady as I said, "Be gone by morning." She let out a soft, broken gasp, as if the reality of it had finally hit her. "David, please." I didn't look back. I didn't have to, because for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. And for her, this was only the beginning of her downfall. I slept soundly that night. Or maybe it wasn't sleep. Maybe it was just peace. The kind that comes when you finally rip out the rot before it spreads any further. The kind that settles deep in your bones when you know, without a doubt, that you've made the right choice. By the time I woke up, the house was silent. I stretched, rolled over, and checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. Just an empty inbox and a beautiful, weightless feeling in my chest. For the first time in years, I had no reason to care where Julia was. But as I walked downstairs, a part of me wondered, had she actually left? I found my answer in the living room. Julia was still there. She sat curled up on the couch, her face pale, her makeup from the night before smudged under her eyes. The designer dress she had worn to her affair was now wrinkled, hanging off her shoulders like a ghost of the woman she had pretended to be. She hadn't packed. She hadn't moved. She just sat there, clutching a glass of wine she probably poured herself at some ungodly hour, staring blankly at nothing. I let out a slow breath. She looked broken, but I felt nothing. I grabbed a bottle of water from the kitchen, twisted off the cap, and took a slow sip before saying, "Why are you still here?" Julia blinked up at me as if she had just realized I was in the room. "David, don't," I said sharply. "Don't say my name like that. Just answer the question." She let out a shaky breath, setting the wine glass down. "I don't have anywhere to go." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "Not even Ryan?" She winced. He doesn't know yet." I arched an eyebrow. "Doesn't know what? That you got caught?" Silence. Then, a slow, pitiful nod. And there it was, the real reason she was still here. She hadn't stayed because she wanted to fix things. She had stayed because she was stalling, scrambling to figure out her next move, hoping to manipulate me one last time. It was almost sad. Almost. I took another sip of water and leaned against the counter. "You should call him," I said simply. "Tell him the good news." Julia swallowed hard. "David." "Call him, Julia." Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. She hesitated for a moment before dialing, her fingers trembling against the screen. I watched, arms crossed over my chest, as she put the call on speaker. It rang. Once. Twice. Then, "Hey, beautiful." Ryan's voice was smooth, arrogant, utterly unaware of the disaster waiting for him. Julia's throat bobbed as she forced herself to speak. "Ryan, we need to talk." There was a pause. "Everything okay?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then Julia's voice, small and fragile. "David knows." Silence. A heavy, brutal silence. Then, "Shit." Julia squeezed her eyes shut. "Can we meet?" More silence. And then, the final nail in the coffin. "I don't think that's a good idea." Her breath hitched. "Ryan." "Listen, Julia." His voice was different now. No more charm. No more warmth. Just cold, calculated detachment. "I told you from the beginning, I wasn't looking for anything serious." A sharp inhale. "But you said—" "I said a lot of things," he cut in. "But that was when your husband wasn't involved." Julia went rigid. "I left him for you." "That was a mistake." And just like that, her entire world shattered. I watched as the realization dawned on her face. Slow, agonizing, soul-crushing. She had thrown away everything for Ryan. And Ryan? He had never planned to catch her when she fell. Take care, Julia. Click. The call ended. Julia sat there, phone still in her trembling hands, eyes wide with disbelief. She looked up at me, her expression raw, desperate. David, please. I turned around and walked away. She wasn't my problem anymore. Julia didn't cry. Not right away. She just sat there, gripping her phone, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. It was as if her mind couldn't process what had just happened. Like she was still trying to rewrite reality, still trying to make herself believe that Ryan would call back, that this wasn't really happening. But I knew better. And now, so did she. I stood by the stairs, arms crossed, watching her in silence. I expected rage. I expected bargaining. I expected the sharp, venomous Julia who could manipulate any situation in her favor. But what I got instead was nothing. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she looked empty. Good. She had spent a year tearing me apart piece by piece, and now? Now, she was the one who had nothing left. Finally, after what felt like forever, she spoke. I gave up everything for him, she whispered. I tilted my head. No, Julia. You gave up everything for yourself? Her eyes snapped to mine, and for a brief moment, I saw it. Anger, defiance, that old spark of arrogance she always carried. But it flickered out just as quickly as it had come, because deep down, she knew I was right. What am I supposed to do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shrugged. That's not my problem. She let out a breath, something between a sigh and a sob, but I felt nothing for her. Not pity, not sympathy, not even satisfaction, just closure. I walked toward the entryway and pulled out a folder from the drawer. It was thick, neatly organized, filled with documents I had been preparing for the past week. I tossed it onto the coffee table in front of her. Divorce papers, I said simply. Sign them and get out. Julia's fingers hovered over the folder, hesitant. You already had these ready? Of course, I said, leaning against the wall. I've been 2 steps ahead of you for a while now. She flipped open the folder, scanning the pages. And then, just like that, her spine straightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. You're cutting me off, she realized. I smirked. You didn't actually think you were getting anything, did you? Her nostrils flared. David, I was your wife for 10 years. You can't just... Actually, I can. I grabbed another paper from the folder and held it up. Prenup. You signed it. And guess what? You broke the terms the moment you cheated. She paled. You're leaving with nothing, I continued, my voice cold. No house, no money, no Ryan. I smiled, but there was no humor in it. Welcome to rock bottom, Julia. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the papers, scanning the fine print, probably looking for some loophole, some last-minute way to save herself. But there was none. She had burned all her bridges. This isn't fair, she whispered. I laughed, shaking my head. Fair? You don't get to talk about fair. Not after what you did. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. David, please. Just let me stay here for a little while, until I figure things out. I exhaled, rubbing a hand down my face. Jesus, Julia. You still think I owe you something? Silence. I leaned down, placing my hands on the coffee table, staring her straight in the eyes. You made your choices. Now live with them. Her lip trembled, but I didn't care. You have 24 hours to get your shit and leave, I said, standing up straight. After that, I changed the locks. And with that, I turned and walked away. I didn't need to see her reaction. I had already won. Julia was still there the next morning. I wasn't surprised. People like her, they don't leave quietly. They cling, they stall, they wait for a miracle that never comes. But I had given her 24 hours, and I wasn't about to change my mind. I walked downstairs, half expecting to find her with some grand speech prepared, some last-ditch attempt to manipulate her way out of this. Instead, she was sitting at the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee in front of her, staring at nothing. She looked tired, hollow. I almost didn't recognize her. Good. I poured myself a cup, ignoring the way she tensed when I moved past her. The silence between us was heavy, but I didn't care enough to break it. If she wanted to say something, she would. And eventually, she did. "David," she murmured, "do you really hate me that much?" I took a slow sip, then set my cup down. "No, Julia, I don't hate you." She blinked, looking up at me, almost hopeful. "I feel nothing for you," I finished. "And that's worse, isn't it?" Her mouth parted slightly, her hands tightening around her mug. For the first time, I saw it. The realization that I was truly done. That there was no path back to the life she had so carelessly thrown away. "I never wanted this," she whispered. I didn't know how to stop." I huffed out a laugh. "You didn't want to stop?" She looked down, her fingers trembling. "I don't know how to be alone, David." I tilted my head. "Sounds like a you problem." Silence. Then she let out a slow, shaky breath. "What am I supposed to do now?" I shrugged. "Figure it out." She let out a hollow laugh. "That's it? After everything? What do you want me to say, Julia?" I asked, leaning against the counter. "That I forgive you? That I feel sorry for you? That I'll swoop in and save you like I always have?" I shook my head. "No, that part of my life is over." She swallowed hard. "And Ryan?" I smirked. "Ryan made it very clear where he stands, didn't he?" Her face twisted with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, regret, shame. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. "Your deadline's up in 3 hours. Be gone by then." I turned to leave, but before I could, she spoke again. "David." Asterisk. I exhaled sharply, already exhausted. "What?" She hesitated, then whispered. "Was any of it real?" I froze. For a second, I thought about all of it. The years we had spent together, the moments that had once been happy, the memories we had built before everything rotted from the inside out. I thought about the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman who had held my hand in the rain, who had whispered promises against my skin, who had once been my home. And then I thought about the woman in that hotel room, the woman who had laughed at my obliviousness, who had spent months lying to my face, who had betrayed everything we had built. "Maybe it was," I said finally, "but it isn't anymore." I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because when I walked out of that kitchen, I left Julia behind. For good. By the time I returned home that evening, she was gone. No note. No last-ditch effort to plead her case. Just gone. The house felt different without her, quieter in a way that wasn't lonely, just free. It was strange how quickly peace could settle into a place once the poison was gone. I walked through the rooms, expecting to feel something. Sadness, regret, anger. But there was nothing. Just the cold realization that us, had ended long before today. The only difference now was that I had finally chosen to accept it. I poured myself a drink and sat in the living room, letting the silence stretch around me. I had spent so much time reacting to Julia's betrayal, playing defense, trying to regain control. Now, for the first time in a long time, I was in the driver's seat. And I knew exactly what my next move would be. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. I wanted everything finalized as quickly as possible. No drawn-out court battles, no pointless negotiations. Just a clean, surgical cut. "She might try to contest the prenup," my lawyer warned, scanning the paperwork, "especially since she's leaving with nothing." I smirked. "She can try, but we both know she won't win." The evidence was airtight. Her infidelity, the financial records proving she had siphoned money, the legal documents locking her out of everything. There was no room for debate. And even if she did try to fight it, I knew something she didn't. Julia wasn't built for struggle. She had spent her whole life taking the easy route, latching onto comfort, using people as stepping stones. She wasn't the kind of woman who clawed her way back from rock bottom. She was the kind of woman who stayed there. And judging by the way Ryan had discarded her so quickly, she didn't have a backup plan. Not this time. "How long until it's official?" I asked. "A couple of months, depending on how quickly she signs." I nodded, satisfied. "Make sure she knows this isn't a negotiation." She signs, or she gets buried in legal fees she can't afford. My lawyer smirked. Remind me never to get on your bad side, David. I downed the last of my coffee and stood. You'd have to betray me first. Later that evening, I got a text from an old friend. Emma, heard about Julia. Drinks this weekend? I stared at the message for a long moment, a small smile tugging at the corner of my lips. Emma. We had met in college, back when life had been simpler, before careers and marriages and betrayals. She had always been the one who got away, the friend who could have been more if timing had been different. I hadn't spoken to her in years. But maybe now, maybe it was time to start looking forward instead of back. I texted her back. Me, drinks sound good. Friday? Her reply was almost instant. Emma, it's a date. For the first time in a long time, I felt something new. Hope. Julia did exactly what I expected. She tried to fight. Not with lawyers. She wasn't stupid enough to waste money on a losing battle. No, she chose a different tactic. She tried to ruin me. It started small. Whispers among mutual friends, carefully planted rumors. David was cold, controlling, neglectful. Then, she got desperate. One morning, I woke up to a string of messages from colleagues, asking if I was okay. Confused, I checked my social media. Julia had posted a long, emotional message about how she had been trapped in an unhappy marriage, about how she had made mistakes, but wasn't the only one to blame. She painted herself as the victim, spinning our divorce into a tragic love story gone wrong. The comments flooded in. People who didn't know the truth, people who thrived on drama, people who had no idea what she had done. They all sided with her. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of rage. Not because she was lying. I had expected that. But because she still thought she could win. She still thought she had power over me. She was wrong. That afternoon, I met Emma for drinks. She looked just like I remembered. Sharp, confident, with that same knowing smirk that had always made her stand out. So, she said, setting her whiskey down, your ex-wife is making a spectacle of herself. I huffed out a laugh. That obvious? Let's just say my entire feed is full of people who suddenly think you're the villain. She tilted her head, studying me. How do you want to handle it? I leaned back in my chair, considering my options. Julia wanted attention. She wanted sympathy. The best way to beat someone like that? Take it away from them. I don't, I said simply. Let her burn herself out. The people who matter already know the truth. Emma raised an eyebrow. That's very mature of you. Not really, I admitted. I just don't waste time on people who don't deserve it anymore. Something flickered across her face. Approval. Maybe. Good answer, she said, lifting her glass. To new beginnings? I clinked my glass against hers. To better endings. And as I looked at her, really looked at her, I realized something. This wasn't just an escape from Julia. This was the start of something real. It didn't take long for Julia's pity party to fall apart. Her carefully crafted lies started to unravel the moment people realized I wasn't reacting. I didn't defend myself, didn't engage, didn't play the game she wanted me to play. And without a villain to fight, people lost interest. The comments on her dramatic post dried up. The sympathy turned to indifference. And then, inevitably, to suspicion. Because no matter how well she played the victim, the truth had a way of surfacing. People started asking questions. They started remembering the inconsistencies in her stories, the late-night whispers, the way she had clung to luxury while pretending to be trapped. And just like that, Julia lost everything. I got the final divorce papers in the mail 2 weeks later. Signed. Sealed. Done. She hadn't even fought it in the end. Maybe she realized there was nothing left to fight for. I stared at the envelope for a long time, letting the weight of it settle in. Not grief, not sadness, just finality. A chapter closed. A clean slate. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. That Friday, I met Emma for dinner. Not drinks. Not a casual meetup. Dinner. A real date. She showed up in a navy blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes sharp with amusement as she slid into the seat across from me. You look good, she said, smirking. So do you. The waiter came. We ordered. and for the next 2 hours, I found myself lost in something I hadn't felt in years. Good conversation. No tension. No lies. No second-guessing every word. Just easy, effortless chemistry. And when the night ended, when we stepped outside into the cool night air, she hesitated just long enough for me to notice. So I did what I should have done years ago. I kissed her. And this time, I didn't think about the past. Only the future. The next morning, I got one last message from Julia. It was short, bitter. I hope you're happy. I stared at it for a second, then deleted it without responding, because I was happy. And for the first time in a long time, I knew I had one. The end. If you like this story, please like and subscribe to the channel.